I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on whose land we meet today. I also wish to pay my respects to our elders past and present. I've been privileged whilst doing the work that I do over the last 20 or so years, I can't believe it's 20 years, to be encouraged and supported by my own elders, as well as those in the communities I've worked. I acknowledge their contribution in informing the knowledge and position that I take on issues around violence against women and children. Their strength, their courage and their determination inspire me to continue to give voice to their experiences. And in terms of also giving voice to the experiences of Indigenous women and children experiencing violence, so that we may develop a safe and supportive environment in which we can all live and prosper without the fear or damage of violence. Alrighty. So today I speak to you about a subject, Indigenous family violence, that has at various points over the past decade, but particularly in the last several years, been described as a national emergency in our communities, as Australia's tsunami and as a national disgrace. I speak of Indigenous experiences of violence. Mick Dodson stated in his National Press Club release in 2003 that very few families are not struggling with the debilitating effects of trauma, despair and damage resulting from their experiences with violence. If we haven't experienced it personally, then we know somebody who has, and we're often there picking up the pieces with them. Similar such statements as this have been made in inquiries into Aboriginal child sexual abuse and family violence across the country, including here in Queensland. Indeed, the latest report, Not Now, Not Ever, has stated that violence and abuse is reported as being as prevalent in some communities as to have become normalised. The people who live there consider violence to be part of everyday life. The lack of support services and poor access to the justice system compound the violence and make it virtually impossible for victims, predominantly women and children, to escape. The barriers to reporting are many, and they complicate the choices available to Indigenous women as they contemplate the pros and cons of staying and or leaving. Many are very aware that leaving could escalate the violence further and may result in death. On average, across Australia, one woman is killed by her partner every week. Data this year suggested, as the Minister attributed to, that we are going to surpass that statistic. 31 women have been killed this year alone. That's on average 2 women a week. Often the community at large is quick to judge women who choose to stay. In fact, the National Community and Attitude Survey on Violence Against Women reported that 8 in 10 Australians agree that it's hard to understand why women stay. And more than half agreed that women could leave a violent relationship if she really wanted to. These kind of statistics are problematic in that many people find it difficult to comprehend the reality of these women's lives. So let's have a look at what that looks like just for a moment. This poster was developed with the input of 4 Indigenous communities in Victoria as part of a major Australian Research Council grant that I was involved in, looking at partnerships in family violence. These communities felt that to understand why partnerships fail, we needed to understand what it was to walk in the shoes of a victim of domestic and family violence. We needed to appreciate why she believes, the woman in the middle, that nobody is helping her, that nobody believes her enough to support her to navigate the mixed messages she is receiving. So if we look at some of these mixed messages, if you look at the family, they're saying you can't split the family up. What did you go to the coppers for? It's your own fault. Everyone's really pissed off at you at the moment and they're hassling us too. The kids saying, I hate you, it's all your fault. You're leaving Dad, you're putting Daddy in jail. We can't go home because of you. I'm not leaving school. And then you'll have his family saying, you're making it hard for all of us. Cops hanging around. He wouldn't hit you if you didn't deserve it. You know, we'll fight you for the kids. And then you've got the perpetrator saying, I'm sorry, it was an accident, it won't happen again. You can't leave me, I'll kill myself. You leave, you're not taking my kids. Where do you think you're going to go? I'll find you, I'll kill you. The community, they're saying you're splitting up the family. What about the kids? They need their dad. You'll send him to jail. You'll kill him. You know what happens in there. You're dividing the community. It's all that worker's fault. She's making her do it. But then you have our elders that are sending a different message. They're saying this isn't culture. This violence isn't okay. We have the police that are saying, if you're not going to do anything about it, we will. We will apply for an intervention order. They'll say, you're wasting our time, particularly if this is not the first time that they've been to your home. They'll say, he told us you hit him back. We'll have to charge you too. You got outstanding warrants. We'll be locking you both up. Is that what really happened? But weren't you drunk? You've got the refuge workers saying you can do something, you can leave or get an AVO, I can help you. If you stay here though, your 10-year-old son can't. And that often excludes a lot of Aboriginal families from wanting to go to refuges. Then you've got the silent supporters, and there are many in our community, men and women who want to help, who can see the violence isn't her fault, but they're too scared to speak up. They stay silent, they don't get involved. We have the courts, and our community is notorious for seeing them as scary places, and that the judges can be judgmental at times, depending on who they get on a particular day. We have people with disabilities, and when we think about the number of disabilities in our community, this one's a really important one. They're getting messages of, sorry, we can't help you. We don't have the support or that kind of assistance available in our service for you. So often Aboriginal women who have disabilities will go, for example, to their disability worker who they're very familiar with, and say that disability worker isn't around today, and they get the next person that's there and they'll say, oh, that's family violence. Why don't we send you across to the Aboriginal service? They'll know what to do. Yeah, but the victim may be reluctant to go to the Aboriginal service because his family might work there, right? But she goes anyway. But she's deaf, so she's got to write everything down. And then that service says, sorry, we can't help you. We don't have access to the refuge. You'll have to go to the refuge. She goes to the refuge. Sorry, we don't have interpreters. So what does she do? She goes home because she knows what to expect at home, because all of the places that she's been to get help haven't supported her. And too often we don't put ourselves in the shoes of that person that is bound not just by their race and the experiences of their race, but also are bound by other experiences such as disability. Then we have child protection, and I want to really focus on child protection today, where they're saying you have to leave him or we'll take the kids. Your violence is hurting the kids. And note that the focus is on your violence is hurting the kids. You need to do a family violence course, a parenting course. Prove to us you don't that you don't drink alcohol in front of your kids. And the big message, we'll be watching you. These are the messages, the multiple messages, all at the one time, that the Aboriginal woman in the middle is receiving. It is incredibly difficult for her to make a choice about whether to stay or to go. And certainly if you're in any of those categories of the people that are providing that person support, it's important to think about what other messages she's getting so you can tailor your response to her. So over the past 30 years, there's been a flurry of research into the consequences of children's exposure to family violence. As researchers and practitioners begun to appreciate the gravity of the damage caused by family violence, policies, albeit only in the last 10 years or so in Australia, have been developed to acknowledge, counteract and/or minimise the damage. These policies have in some instances mandated and increased reporting responsibilities onto a whole range of professionals, resulting in increased reporting and surveillance by those outside the family unit. For example, police, when attending domestic or family violence situations where children are present, will often be mandated to make a report to Child Protection to ensure that the children are safe. Research tells us that witnessing domestic violence can involve a range of incidences, that it can range from the child only hearing the violence to the child being forced to participate in the violence or being used as part of the violent incident. And consequently, there's an increased trend of children of domestic and family violence survivors being placed in the care of the state. The pretext for the removal is that the mother has failed to protect her children or has participated in domestic and family violence. There's a disturbing tendency for child protection workers to see domestic and family violence as relationship conflict, a symptom of problematic parenting, or as an anger management issue. And whilst being given little or no practical support, child protection support by Child Protection to assist in keeping themselves and their children safe, case plans commonly contain demands that mothers must tell Child Protection if they move and be open to caseworkers coming to their homes, attend parenting courses and counselling, obtain protection orders or family law orders for residents, be available for routine or random drug and alcohol testing, and to find appropriate housing. These conditions are in stark contrast to the lack of scrutiny and interventions that are placed on the perpetrators of violence. Indeed, in the eyes of Child Protection, the perpetrators often become invisible as the mothers become the focus of their intervention. And often that's a situation where, why would the perpetrators of the violence want to adhere to what Child Protection have to say? You know, they're not interested in that. And often Child Protection, because they can't get in contact with the father, will give messages to the mother to tell the father X, Y, and Z. But that, again, is going to be in breach of orders. Right? So the mum is very much in a no-win situation. Estimates of children exposed to the violence of their parents in Australia vary from 12 to 23%. However, international research suggests these figures are more likely to be in the vicinity of 30 to 50%. And I would hesitate to say that in Indigenous communities it would probably be even higher than that. We don't have exact statistics on it. Research in the area of children's exposure to this type of violence has documented the serious negative consequences for children's development and health, but that the effect will vary depending on a child's sex, their age, their race, and their stage of development. It also notes that children living in families experiencing such violence are also at an increased risk of being victims of child abuse, quite separately. In fact, domestic and family violence has been shown to be a common factor among children who are victims of fatal assaults. The New South Wales Child Death Review Team, for example, notes that for children who died as a result of a fatal assault in 2008, domestic violence was among the list of most common factors experienced on an ongoing basis prior to their death. Specific data on the extent to which Aboriginal children are exposed to domestic and family violence is relatively unknown. Statistics of prevalence are hard to disentangle because of various variances in state and territory practices for recording notifications of child abuse. In particular, some states and territories record exposure to domestic and family violence as emotional abuse or as neglect. And certainly when you look at the categories of abuse that is substantiated in Indigenous communities, we are way up there for emotional abuse and neglect. They're the top in forms of abuse that are substantiated in our communities and would be related to family violence. In New South Wales, they periodically record the exposure to domestic and family violence within their data sets. During 2006-07, for example, domestic violence was the most frequently reported issue for 49% of Aboriginal children involved with the department. And this was in contrast to 45% for other children. Also pertinent to domestic and family violence in an examination of the children's case files was that it was noticed that Indigenous children were experiencing other risk factors for domestic violence, including twice the rate of at the rate of twice that of non-Aboriginal children. So issues such as the carer's use of alcohol and the carer's use of drug use, both of those were at increased levels. Unlike in North America, for example, where child protection systems routinely record family violence as a separate category of abuse, and from this data, they can estimate, for example, that 2% of those cases result in placements in out-of-home care, and upwards of 10% are placed in out-of-home care where other types of violence is co-occurring. We don't have that data capacity. And it would be a really important initiative for us to be able to engage in getting that data, to understand and appreciate, given the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in care. It's against this background clear that the effect of witnessing family violence isn't something that we should ignore or downplay, particularly given it's a consequence on the whole family unit, not just mum, not just the kids. But I think we really have to ask some serious questions about child protection. Is threatening mum with removal and or actual removal of the children from her care the best approach? Is the placement of these conditions helpful in responding to the trauma experienced by mum and the child? Because they're both going to be traumatised yet again should the children be removed. Is mum leaving one abuser, being her partner, only to find another abuser in a place that should be providing care and support, that being the state and the removal of her children? The situation becomes more complicated when the state believes that the involvement of child protection alone is not enough to protect children from their parents' violence and legislates in this place. And this is a move that is happening internationally, but it is also happening here in Australia. So failure to protect laws have been introduced over the last 10 years in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in Canada, more recently in New Zealand, in South Australia, and a version focused on sexual assault specifically came into effect in Victoria in October last year. Other states are currently considering its application in their jurisdictions. These laws have come about largely as a consequence of pressure from and in response to highly publicised preventable child deaths. So it's not surprising that the community at large wants people to be held responsible for children's deaths. These new laws are holding adults who fail to take action where they know or believe that a child that they have custody of or care for live in the same household is suffering sexual abuse or abuse that may result in serious injury or death. A child they were living in the same household as dies due to child abuse, and the adult was aware of the abuse and its seriousness. The penalty for this is imprisonment, and the rate of imprisonment or the length of imprisonment varies across all of the jurisdictions. What is difficult is the defining reasonable steps is problematic. In Canada, for example, the standard has been set that a person who provides a marked departure from the conduct of a reasonably prudent parent in circumstances where it is objectively foreseeable that the omission would lead to a risk of danger to the child's life or a risk of permanent endangerment to its health. And in the United States, the expectation is that the mother is to step outside of protecting herself and lay her life down for the child if she has to, or at a minimum, call authorities. A history of domestic violence is often held against mothers in failure to protect laws, particularly if they can point to failed attempts to leave their abusive partners as proof that the mother wasn't completely helpless and could have done more to save a child. Others cite contact with police or social workers about domestic violence prior to the child's injury as missed opportunities for disclosure that have further endangered the child. Many present the man's violence as a testament to the mother's poor decision making. So let's explore some examples so that we know what we could potentially be in for. In a recent case in Texas, for example, Alina Lindley said Alonzo Turner was a sweet guy when she first started dating him. She said he was kind to her and her toddler son, Titches, but a few months later, Turner began abusing them both. Punching, throwing, choking become part of their daily lives. When Lindley once tried to escape to her father's house, Turner tracked her down, threw her in the trunk of his car, and brought her back home. Lindley tried to escape again after Turner whipped Titches with a belt, threw him against the wall, and stuck his face in the toilet. She grabbed Titches and ran for the door, but Turner snatched him from her and locked her out of the house. Titches was dead by the end of the day. Turner pled guilty to murder and was sentenced to prison for life. Yet Lindley, the mum, was sent to prison too. She got 45 years under Texas injury to a child by omission law. An examination of 28 mothers who were victims of domestic violence in 11 US states found that they all had received at least 10 years prison for failing to protect their children. Almost half were given 20 years or more. In one case, the mother was given a life sentence, just like the man who murdered her infant. In another, the sentences were effectively the same. The killer got life and the mother got 75 years, of which she must serve 63 years and 9 months. In yet another, the mother got a longer sentence than the man who raped her son. And another, a father who fractured an infant girl's toe, femur, and 7 ribs, was sentenced to 2 years, while the mother was sentenced to 30 years for failing to protect. Clearly, the laws, whilst established to protect children, have had unintended consequences. So, while the law applies equally to both mothers and fathers, defendants charged with failure to protect are almost always female, which cannot be explained solely by the fact that women have custody of their children. The range of factors contributing to domestic and family violence will make Indigenous women particularly vulnerable both to the failure to protect policy and also any criminal laws that may be instituted. We also have in Australia increased criminalisation of Indigenous women for being victims of violence. We're having a rate of women fighting back in family violence situations being sent to prison for it. This will add to that criminalisation. And children being separated from their mothers and placed in care or in the abuser's care is also an unintended consequence of this. The latter is particularly concerning given that in 2012 to 13, some 16,500 Indigenous children were placed in at least one out-of-home care placement, and 45% of them were placed in non-Indigenous homes, so not with, they were essentially separated from their familial and cultural links. The work ahead in this space, this is a new space. You know, we're still to see the cases that come before the court to determine the effect on a whole range of people. But in particular, Indigenous women is the focus of my research. We need to work collaboratively with those who know the problem best to ensure that the interests of both mothers and children experiencing violence are served. Utilising the existing evidence base, particularly internationally in this space, needs to inform our practice and our processes. We need to include safety nets to protect our vulnerable victims, to protect our mothers and children. We need to use reflective practice. If we know this hasn't worked in other jurisdictions and that particular groups are vulnerable, then we need to be committed to finding better ways of dealing with this issue. And we need to have continued dialogue with all of those that are going to be affected by this policy as well as the law. The survival of Indigenous families means nothing less than the survival of Indigenous peoples and cultures. Failure to provide the support needed to address the problem of violence and neglect as it affects all community members jeopardises our very existence. Our children represent the future, and Indigenous mothers are an essential key to growing them up strong. Yet, as I've argued today and presented today, Indigenous mothers' rights are under attack if they're subjected to this policy and law. And this is quite evident in the increasing overrepresentation of Indigenous children in out-of-home care. We need to ensure that the state doesn't take the step undertaken internationally and criminalise those mothers as well. Acknowledging the reality of their situation is fundamental to moving forward. Thinking about that woman in the middle is what we need to do when we think about the services we're going to deliver, the laws we're going to write, the policies we're going to enact. And I thank you for listening to me. There's a lot there. Thank you.